The planet burned. From high orbit, the Galactic fleet watched the last vestiges of Earth's resistance collapse in flames. Great pillars of smoke rose from once mighty cities, curling into the stratosphere like the ghosts of a dying species. Alien commanders, adorned in ceremonial armor, stood aboard their flagship and observed the spectacle with cold satisfaction. The war had been long, but it was over. Humanity had fought with a ferocity unseen in the history of the galaxy. But in the end, superior numbers and technology had prevailed. On the surface, among the ruins of a once thriving metropolis, a team of 6 figures moved through the wreckage with practiced silence. They were ghosts in the firelight, shadows slipping between gutted buildings, their weapons tight against their bodies. Their leader, a hardened Navy SEAL known only as Bishop, crouched behind the shattered remains of a collapsed highway and studied the enemy ahead. The alien patrols moved with an air of carelessness. Their war was won after all. Their long, sinewy forms were draped in ceremonial sashes, their weapons slung lazily across their backs. They were warriors bred for conquest, but they had never fought a species like humanity before. They had never known a war where technology meant less than sheer will, where tactics crumbled before raw determination. Bishop had seen it 100 times over the past few years, aliens mistaking their victory for certainty. That was their first mistake. He raised a gloved fist, signaling his team to hold. The ruins around them groaned in protest, twisted metal shifting in the embers of war. He felt the heat of smoldering steel against his face, but ignored it. The world had become fire and death, but his focus remained sharp. He studied the enemy's movements, lazy, undisciplined, unprepared. The weight of their overconfidence settled into his mind like a steel blade. His radio crackled in his ear. Bishop command confirms. Primary target is the relay station. The voice was quiet but firm. Bishop pressed a finger to his earpiece. Acknowledged. The relay station was their objective, a heavily fortified hub of alien communications nestled deep within what had once been a financial district. Destroying it would throw the invaders' command network into chaos. It would not win the war. It would not even shift the tide. But it would remind them that humanity was still breathing, still clawing at their throats. Bishop turned to his team. Their faces were smeared with soot and blood, their eyes hardened by the horrors of a war they had long since stopped trying to understand. They were the last of their kind, not just soldiers, but survivors of a species that refused to die. He met each of their gazes in turn. "They think it's over," he said. His voice was low, steady. "They think we're finished." No one spoke. They all knew the truth. He checked his rifle, the matte black finish dulled by ash. The grip was worn from years of battle, the scratches and dents a testament to the countless fights it had seen. He exhaled once, then rose from his position. They moved as one, silent, precise, deadly. The first alien never saw them coming. Bishop's blade slid through its throat before it could make a sound, its body crumpling into the rubble. The second turned, mandibles clicking in surprise, but a suppressed shot from Bishop's right ended its life before it could call out. The team advanced through the ruins, each movement calculated, each kill executed with brutal efficiency. By the time the enemy realized they were under attack, it was already too late. Gunfire erupted in the streets, brief and violent. Muzzle flashes illuminated the darkness in bursts of white-hot fury. The aliens scrambled, their shouts turning to screams as they fell one by one. Bishop's team moved like wraiths, striking and disappearing before the enemy could mount a response. The bodies piled in the dust, and still they pressed forward. An explosion rocked the air as a grenade found its mark, sending shards of alien metal and flesh spiraling into the night. The relay station loomed ahead, its structure pulsing with an eerie blue light. They were close now, too close for the enemy to recover. Bishop motioned to his demolitions expert, a grizzled soldier known as Graves. The man nodded and sprinted forward, planting charges along the station's support beams. The rest of the team provided cover, cutting down anything that moved. Then, the unmistakable sound of reinforcements. A low hum filled the air, growing into a deafening roar as an alien dropship descended from the blackened sky. Its floodlights bathed the battlefield in a harsh, sterile glow. The team dove for cover as energy rounds scorched the ground around them. "We're out of time," Graves called, finishing the last of the charges. Bishop didn't hesitate. "Detonate now." Graves pressed the trigger. The world turned white. The explosion ripped through the relay station, sending fire and debris skyward in a chaotic maelstrom. The shockwave sent the dropship careening, its stabilizers failing as it spun out of control. It slammed into a nearby building, erupting into a secondary explosion that painted the night with fresh fire. Bishop rose from cover, surveying the destruction. The relay station was gone. The enemy's command network was in disarray. For the first time since the war began, the Galactic fleet had been caught off guard. As the smoke cleared, Bishop turned to his team. "They forgot rule number 1. Graves smirked through the blood on his face. "And what's that, boss?" Bishop locked eyes with the burning wreckage ahead, his expression unreadable. Never underestimate a human. The war was far from over. But tonight, the enemy had been reminded why it had never truly been theirs to win. The silence after the explosion was short-lived. The shockwave had barely settled when the night came alive with movement. Alien foot soldiers poured into the ruins, their elongated forms darting through smoke and fire, weapons raised. Their eyes, wide and black, scanned the wreckage with frantic urgency. Bishop flattened against a broken concrete wall, motioning for his team to hold position. Their breath was steady, their weapons trained on the enemy below. The relay station was gone, but now came the true test: survival. If they were captured, the enemy would wring them dry for information before executing them in some grotesque display of dominance. That wasn't an option. A distant howl split the air, guttural and raw. Bishop recognized the sound immediately. The enemy had unleashed their hunters. The team moved as one, slipping into the shadows of the crumbling cityscape. The wind carried the acrid scent of burning metal and scorched flesh, the remnants of their handiwork. Every step was measured, each movement a calculated whisper against the debris-strewn ground. Their mission was complete, but escape would be the real battle. The first sign of the hunters came in the form of a low growl, barely audible beneath the crackling flames. Then another, closer. Bishop's grip on his rifle tightened. The enemy's beasts were unlike any creature from Earth, sleek, quadrupedal nightmares bred for tracking and killing. Their bodies were covered in dark, chitinous plating, their elongated snouts twitching as they picked up the scent of human sweat and blood. A single command threw hand signals, and the team adjusted formation. Close quarters, back to back. The beasts would attack from all sides, trying to break them apart. A blur of motion. The first hunter lunged from the wreckage, its powerful limbs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. Bishop's rifle snapped up. One shot, center mass. The creature crumpled, its body twitching violently before going still. But there were more. A second hunter vaulted from the ruins, jaws parting to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. Bishop's blade was already in his hand. A quick sidestep, a downward thrust, and the steel met flesh. The creature shrieked as its body collapsed under its own momentum, impaled and lifeless. Gunfire erupted around him. His team was locked in combat, moving in precise coordination. Short, controlled bursts of fire. Sharp, efficient strikes. Every shot counted. Every movement had purpose. Then came the shrill call of the alien commanders. The enemy soldiers, who had hesitated at the sight of the hunters engaging, now surged forward with renewed aggression. They believed the humans were distracted, vulnerable. Another mistake. Bishop was already moving before they reached him. He pivoted, rifle spitting death, cutting down the first wave before they could react. The team followed suit, shifting into a fluid rhythm of fire and maneuver. The air filled with the metallic tang of blood and the sharp scent of plasma burns. Graves let out a grunt as a shot clipped his shoulder, sending him staggering back. Bishop grabbed him by the vest, hauling him behind cover. The demolitions expert clenched his teeth against the pain, but his hand never wavered from his weapon. "We need an exit," Graves growled. Bishop scanned the battlefield. The enemy was pressing in, tightening the noose. They had to move now. His eyes settled on a collapsed overpass leading into the skeletal remains of an old subway tunnel. It was risky. If the enemy collapsed the structure, they'd be trapped. But staying out in the open meant certain death. He made the call. "Tunnel," he barked, and the team moved without hesitation. They sprinted toward the overpass, weaving through the carnage, bullets and plasma bolts tearing through the air around them. One of the hunters, still clinging to life, lunged at their medic Reyes. She spun, her knife flashing, and the creature crumpled mid-leap, its throat severed. They reached the entrance, diving into the tunnel's darkness, just as an explosion rocked the surface above. Dust and debris rained down, coating them in fine gray ash. The enemy was relentless, but they had made it for now. Bishop took point, his rifle's flashlight cutting through the pitch-black tunnel. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped in a slow, rhythmic pattern. The team pressed forward, their footsteps echoing through the silence. They had lost the enemy for the moment, but they couldn't stop. Not yet. Bishop glanced over his shoulder, meeting the eyes of his team. They were bruised, bleeding, exhausted, but alive. And that meant the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The tunnel stretched before them, a yawning abyss swallowed in darkness. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and something more acrid, decay. The remnants of those who had once sought refuge here and failed. Bishop kept his rifle raised, the beam of his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the void. His team followed in practiced silence, each step deliberate, each breath measured. The distant rumble of collapsing structures above reminded them that time was not on their side. Reyes moved up beside him, her voice low. "How long do you think we have before they track us?" Bishop didn't slow his pace. Not long. The enemy had lost sight of them, but they wouldn't stay blind forever. The hunters had their scent, and the alien command wouldn't let a strike like the relay station attack go unanswered. Their escape route was compromised. They needed a new plan, fast. Graves let out a sharp breath, shifting the weight of his wounded arm. The burn along his shoulder was ugly, but he hadn't complained beyond the initial hit. Still, every movement made him wince. "Think we'll find a way out of here before they flush us out?" Graves muttered. Bishop didn't answer. He could feel the weight of his team's exhaustion pressing in, the unspoken question in all their minds. How much longer could they keep running before there was nowhere left to go? The tunnel walls tightened, forcing them into a single-file line as they pressed forward. The ground sloped downward, leading deeper beneath the city's ruins. Water pooled in cracks and crevices, reflecting their lights in broken, shimmering fragments. Then movement. Bishop's fist shot up, signaling a halt. The team froze, their breathing shallow. He tilted his head, listening. There it was again, a faint scrape against concrete, the sound of something shifting in the darkness ahead. Not the enemy. Not the hunters. Something else. He flicked 2 fingers forward, and Reyes took point, slipping ahead with her sidearm drawn. A few steps. Another. Then, a sharp intake of breath. "Bishop," she whispered. He moved to her side, and the beam of his flashlight landed on the figure curled against the tunnel wall. A human. The man was gaunt, his face hollow from starvation, his clothes tattered remnants of a life before the war. He blinked against the sudden light, his breath coming in weak, ragged gasps. Reyes knelt beside him, checking for injuries. He's malnourished, dehydrated. She looked up. He's been down here a while. Bishop crouched, gripping the man's shoulder. What's your name? The man's eyes flickered with recognition, but his voice barely came as a whisper. Denton. Bishop narrowed his gaze. How many of you are down here? Denton coughed, a dry, painful sound. 4. Others sick. His gaze darted past them, deeper into the tunnel. They're watching. Reyes stiffened. Who's watching? Denton shook his head, panic flickering in his hollow eyes. Not them. Not your war. He gripped Bishop's wrist with surprising strength. The Dark Ones. We hid, but so did they. A low, distant chittering sound echoed from further in the tunnel. Something primal, unnatural. Graves swore under his breath. That didn't sound like the bastards we're used to fighting. Bishop helped Denton to his feet. Take us to the others. Now. Denton nodded weakly and turned, leading them deeper into the tunnels. The path grew narrower, the air heavier. The sounds of movement in the shadows were growing. Bishop's instincts screamed danger, but there was no turning back now. They weren't alone down here. And whatever was watching them wasn't afraid. It was waiting. The darkness pressed in around them, thick and suffocating. Each step forward sent echoes rippling through the tunnel, bouncing off unseen walls and disappearing into the void ahead. The air was damp, carrying the scent of rot and something more primal, something wrong. Bishop moved with his rifle raised, eyes scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement at the edge of his light. Denton staggered ahead, his breath ragged, his frame too thin for the weight of exhaustion hanging off him. The others followed in tense silence, their grips tight on their weapons. None of them spoke, but the same thought gnawed at each of them. This wasn't just an abandoned tunnel. Something lived here. A shuffling noise echoed from deeper within. Bishop halted, hand raised. The team froze. The sound wasn't the sharp, measured movement of enemy soldiers or the predatory gait of the hunters. It was erratic dragging, almost human. A dim light flickered in the distance. A makeshift camp, nestled within the ruins of what had once been an old underground junction. Crates, blankets, and scattered debris formed crude shelter, the remains of those who had fled beneath the city to escape the war above. Bishop counted 3 figures, barely more than shadows hunched together near the dying embers of a fire. Denton stumbled forward, his voice weak. It's me. A woman, gaunt and hollow-eyed, looked up first. Her face flickered with relief before hardening into suspicion as she took in the armed soldiers behind him. Another man, older, tightened his grip around a rusted metal pipe as if it could do anything against the rifles in Bishop's hands. The third figure, a boy no older than 12, clutched a blanket, his eyes too wide, too knowing for someone his age. Reyes moved first, stepping toward them with slow, open hands. We're not here to hurt you. The woman's voice was hoarse. Then why are you here? Graves let out a dry chuckle. Trust me, lady, we didn't exactly plan a sightseeing tour. Bishop cut in. We're looking for a way out. But your friend here says we're not alone down here. The older man exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You shouldn't have come. A scratching noise, faint but deliberate, echoed from the tunnel behind them. Bishop turned sharply, rifle up. Nothing. The others heard it too. The woman pulled the boy closer, her knuckles white. Denton's voice was barely above a whisper. They come when the fire gets low. Reyes glanced at Bishop, her expression grim. We need to move. Now. Then the light flickered again, and this time, the darkness shifted. A shape peeled itself from the tunnel walls, its movement unnatural, insectal. Limbs too long, a head cocked at an impossible angle. It didn't breathe, didn't make a sound beyond the soft rasp of claws against stone. Then another emerged. And another. Bishop didn't wait. Contact. The tunnel exploded into chaos. Gunfire roared, the muzzle flashes lighting up the creatures in frozen, stuttering glimpses. Their bodies were wrong. twisted things of sinew and chitin, their eyes hollow pits that reflected nothing. The first bullet struck center mass, but the thing barely reacted, jerking only slightly before lunging forward. Reyes fired 3 rounds into another, aiming for the head. This time it dropped. The others took note, their movements shifting, recalculating. Headshots. Bishop barked. The team adjusted, their shots precise. Creatures collapsed, their bodies twitching, limbs curling inward. But more were coming. They moved like liquid shadow, pouring from unseen crevices in the tunnel walls, their numbers endless. The woman grabbed the boy, dragging him toward the far end of the junction. There's another way out. Bishop didn't hesitate. Move. The group broke into sprint, ducking through rusted scaffolding and collapsing debris. Graves tossed a grenade behind them, the explosion sending rock and dust cascading in all directions. The tunnel trembled. The creatures shrieked, the first real sound they had made, an inhuman, chittering wail that vibrated through bone. The exit loomed ahead, a rusted maintenance door, half buried in rubble. Denton and the older man scrambled to pull it free while the rest of the team laid down covering fire. The creatures hesitated at the explosion's aftershock, their forms writhing just beyond the dust cloud. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they stopped. They lingered at the edges of the flickering firelight, heads twitching, bodies shifting in unnatural rhythm. Watching, waiting. The woman yanked the door open. Go now. Bishop pushed Reyes through first, then Graves. The civilians followed. He turned back for one last glance. The creatures remained motionless, their hollow eyes locked onto him, as if they knew something he didn't. Then he stepped through, and the door slammed shut behind him. The door groaned as it shut, the sound reverberating through the narrow passageway beyond. Dust and rust flaked off the metal as Bishop pressed his weight against it, securing the seal. He could still feel them on the other side watching, waiting. The air in the new tunnel was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and something ancient, something undisturbed for too long. Reyes was already moving ahead, her rifle sweeping the passage as she led the civilians forward. The woman clutched the boy's hand, her face drawn tight with exhaustion and fear. The old man, silent and resolute, helped Denton along, though the younger man looked as though he might collapse at any moment. Graves leaned against the tunnel wall, breath ragged, his wounded arm trembling. "Where does this lead?" Bishop asked, keeping his voice low. The woman hesitated. "It connects to the old subway. There was an emergency exit before the war, before everything." Reyes glanced at Bishop. "And if it's caved in?" The woman swallowed hard. "Then we find another way." Bishop exhaled, rubbing a hand across his jaw. The creatures hadn't pursued them. That alone put him on edge. They had watched him, let him go, as if they knew something he didn't. That wasn't the behavior of mindless predators. It was strategy. And that meant this wasn't over. The tunnel sloped downward, the walls tightening, forcing them to move in single file. The light from their flashlights bounced across corroded metal and crumbling concrete, illuminating remnants of a world left behind. A half-buried train car lay on its side, skeletal remains of passengers still strapped into rusted seats. Time had stripped them of flesh, leaving only hollow sockets staring into the dark. The boy whimpered. The woman hushed him, pulling him closer. Graves let out a dry cough. "Remind me again why we ever thought going underground was a good idea?" Bishop ignored him, scanning ahead. Something fell off. It wasn't just the silence. It was the weight of it, the oppressive stillness pressing down on them like a living thing. Then Reyes stopped short, her breath catching. Bishop moved to her side and followed her gaze. Ahead, the tunnel widened into a vast chamber, an old service bay for the subway. Massive steel beams arched overhead, disappearing into the darkness. A rusted maintenance platform stood against one wall, its stairwell partially collapsed. And in the center of the chamber, bodies, dozens of them, human and alien alike, scattered across the ground in a grotesque tapestry of limbs and ruptured flesh. Some were fresh, others reduced to little more than bones. The stench of death hung thick, almost tangible. The old man made a strangled sound in the back of his throat. The woman pulled the boy's face into her shoulder, turning him away. Reyes tightened her grip on her rifle. This wasn't a battle. Bishop stepped forward carefully, scanning the scene. She was right. There were no signs of gunfire, no scorch marks from plasma rounds. The kills were too precise, too deliberate. Something had fed here. Then the air shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint ripple in the stale atmosphere. Then a whisper. No, not a whisper. A chittering, soft and layered, like dry leaves scraping across stone. Bishop turned sharply. The shadows were moving. Not one. Not two. Dozens. They poured from the crevices of the chamber, peeling from the walls and ceiling like living nightmares. Their hollow eyes gleamed in the dim light, their limbs unfolding with sickening precision. They had waited, stalked, herded. The door hadn't been an escape. It had been a trap. Move, Bishop bellowed. Gunfire erupted as the team fell into formation. Reyes unloaded a full burst, her rounds cutting down the first wave. Graves fired one-handed, his injured arm pressed tight against his chest as he took down anything that moved. Bishop spun, dropping one, then two, then three. But for every one that fell, more emerged. Denton screamed as a creature lunged, its claws raking across his side before Bishop's bullet tore through its skull. The old man pulled him back, dragging him toward the rusted platform. The stairwell, Reyes shouted. Go! The civilians scrambled up first, the woman practically carrying the boy. The old man shoved Denton ahead, forcing him upward. Reyes emptied her last magazine, then turned to run. A creature lunged. Bishop caught it midair, his knife flashing. It shrieked as he drove the blade into the soft tissue beneath its jaw, twisting hard before ripping it free. Graves stumbled. The blood loss was getting to him. Another creature closed in. Bishop grabbed him, dragging him up the stairs. The platform groaned under their combined weight. Rust flaked, metal creaked. The creatures swarmed below, their claws scraping against steel, their heads twitching in unnatural rhythm. Then a head light. A service hatch. Reyes slammed her shoulder into it, once, twice. It burst open, a gust of cold night air rushing in. Bishop shoved the civilians through first. Reyes followed, then Graves. Bishop was the last to climb through, turning for one final glance. The creatures had stopped. They stood motionless on the platform below, their hollow eyes locked onto him. And then in unison, they stepped back into the dark, disappearing as silently as they had come. Bishop pulled the hatch shut behind him, sealing the tunnel once and for all. For the first time since the war began, he wasn't sure who the real enemy was.